Okay, I think it's time to begin. Welcome to our Bible class at the famous Elmore congregation. We have begun a study of the general epistles, but they are not general themes. We're going to be looking at James this morning. Start a two-part series on James. Good morning. Aaron, how you doing, man? Awesome. I suppose if there's a book that I've heard more about being, the gospel of common sense, um, it's always James. James seems to have the title of being the one that is down to earth, and people seem to enjoy it a lot. However, when you read it, though it does seem very practical, it has its own oddities. And I don't mean an oddity of, there, there's some strange statements in it. There's difficulty in looking at structure. And one of the reasons for that is James might be better suited with the title of being the New Testament wisdom book. And the reason I say that is because, like in Proverbs, you look at what we would refer to as the wisdom genre of the Old Testament. Ecclesiastes is another one. It's sporadic in its teaching. It's difficult to see a flow or a structure. It's mainly seems to be grouped by various themes that are all over the place, and that's what Proverbs is. You also see in James a contrast between good and evil, from above, down below, those kinds of things, which is characteristic of what we would think of wisdom literature. So maybe James, because it's gained the reputation of being a common sense book, is because it's actually a book of wisdom. And I think that would be more accurately a description of the book of James, or the letter that was written. The interesting thing about James is his name is not James. We've learned his wrong name. Did you know that? In the original, it's Jacob. It's Jacob. You know why the translators made it James? So you wouldn't confuse it with the Jacob of the Old Testament. So we have learned his name as James. You look shocked. Don, are you shocked? His name is Jacob, but we know him as James. That's all right. And there's that distinction that was made by translators, and it became the custom then because, no translation is going to divert from the name James because it's kind of rooted in Christian history. So, just to make you aware of that, I thought that was an interesting tidbit. We can talk about that more if you'd like, but it's a translation thing. It's like Hosea, the prophet. You remember I brought that up in our Minor Prophets class. His name is Hoshea. That's his Hebrew name. But the reason they made it Hosea is they didn't want anybody to confuse it with one of the kings. And so you have those kinds of things that happen in translations for good or for bad. But when you're aware of that, it's just something that someone might bring up and stump you. And so it's good to know these things. It's not a salvation issue. Go ahead. I don't know. It's Jacob was such. When we say Jacob, the first things that come to your mind is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, probably to the Jew. And so the New Testament translators for a long history decided, in order to keep it distinctive, to say James. So anyway, I thought that was one of the most interesting things when I first started reading Greek. I was reading Yaakov, and I said, "What's this? Where's the word James here? There's this guy? I've been looking for him." Well, that's James. He just had a nickname. Yaakov is his name. James is his nickname that we've given him in English. Yes. Hmm? Yeah. James is Yaakov. So, yeah. So just a little, that would be a good trivia question if I ever had some trivia up here. And I had a prize underneath your pew. You might want to keep that in mind because that definitely will be a question. All right. Okay. So the other aspect of James that makes it interesting is this letter seems to have a broad audience, and it's identified with the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, James would be referring to that in a spiritual sense, and it is related to what happened in the book of Acts when the church dispersed because of Saul's persecution. You remember when Saul was breathing out threats and murder against the Christians. Because of the difficulty, the church, many, went out and began preaching. Went to Samaria, and they just dispersed. And that's what we call the diaspora, the dispersion of Christians. And the interesting thing is, when the Christians went out, okay, who were there in Jerusalem, there were a lot of people that came from other places. Acts 2 talks about all the languages and regional areas that were represented on the day of Pentecost. And they all heard them speak, in their language. So the apostles had the ability, without ever studying it, to speak in the foreign language of the people who were present. The miracle was in the speaking, not in the hearing. So these people remained, and that's one of the reasons why we have a problem in Acts chapter 6, because all the outsiders did not go back. They remained. When Jews came in for the day of Pentecost, the feast, and those who were, baptized and became Christians, a significant number of these individuals were these Hellenistic Jews. Well, the Hellenists were not from Jerusalem. They were not Judean. The Hellenists, Greek speakers, who were Jews but spoke Greek, came from the outside. Okay? So when all of those people, after a period of time, I suppose, they would all eventually go back home. But they remained a long time, and Acts 6 brings up a dispute between the Hebrew-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews. Now, it doesn't mean that the Greek-speaking Jews could not understand or speak, Hebrew. What it means is it's classifying culture. Culture is defined by the language that's spoken. So, one of the neat things about Paul is his training is, early on is Hellenistic, but he also has a good training from the Orthodox Jewish camp. So that made him a prime individual to navigate between two cultures. So when those who had become Christians eventually return back to their homeland, you got Christians who are dispersed. Then you have those who, maybe didn't go back, but when the persecution started, that kind of was a major event that caused Christians to leave Jerusalem, which it was God's intent, because of what Acts chapter 1 says, that the gospel is to be preached in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and where? Yeah, the whole world. So, there's times, and I think part of the persecution might have been, divinely driven, providentially, to get Christians spreading the word. It's always good and enjoyable to be around and kind of focus on ourselves. Well, that's what the Jews did. That they, instead of being a light to the Gentiles, they kind of excluded themselves from the Gentiles in the world, and were not that light upon the hill until Jesus came. So Jesus did what the Jews didn't do, and we're to do what Jesus did. So we have the dispersion, but when the Christians were dispersed, okay, and those who lived in other areas, now that they're Christians, you can imagine if they're coming from Hellenistic centers, Greek areas, villages, towns, hamlets, whatever, and then began working back into the assimilated, areas, there's going to be problems now. They're either going to have to hide their Christianity, or they're going to face certain challenges that maybe they would not have ordinarily faced if they hadn't become Christians. One of the big things is social interaction. We have the big problem in the first century, a lot of it, between the Jew and the Gentile. And Acts 15 is a big section in which they're trying to deal with the clash of cultures. And there's some deference given. There's never the accommodating the gospel. A Christian has to keep in mind that their priority is for the kingdom of God and serving Christ. And so it weighed heavily upon these individuals who are away from Jerusalem and not around the big crowd probably that they were a part of. So they're going to face financial problems. They're going to face culture problems, legal issues. And so I want you to look at James chapter 5. One of the challenges of James is finding the exact context of a particular passage. Where's this happening? And since it's to a dispersion, James writes it in a broad, applicable type of way. And that's why we refer to it more as a wisdom literature, like the book of Proverbs or Ecclesiastes would be. So in James chapter 5, beginning of verse 1, he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Behold, the pay of the laborers who moved into your fields and which have been withheld by you cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and had led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts to a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you." So, is this a railing against Christians who are rich, or the rich who are suppressing or oppressing Christians? Well, it's sort of like the book of Proverbs. There's a broad application, And if it's addressing, let's say, the oppressor, wouldn't that give hope to the oppressed? It's like we're to stand aside for the Lord's vengeance, for I will repay, says the Lord. So in a sense, from a wisdom literature point of view, it could be a message generally to those who are of high state, wealth, and all that. And that the righteous man, okay, is the characterization of the child of God that's dispersed and working in these areas. So there's, a couple of ways of looking at that. But there's definitely going to be some financial challenges by these Christians. Because I know from the Roman Empire point of view, it is very important to be members of guilds and associations and things like that in order to have employment. And when you are a part of these things, sometimes the requirement is to accept or adopt or worship certain false deities, to accept some ideology that is not consistent with Christianity. So we're going to face in James some challenges financially, I think, that we're going to see in regard to the people. You can see the temptation. One of the reasons I think this way is because when James starts talking about when the rich man comes into your assembly, you definitely want to make him or her feel like they're on the top of the world when they're among you, because they're the ones in charge. It's like you don't want to rub the people the wrong way in the first century who are the ones in charge. And so one of the problems that was happening was going too far. Someone comes in the assembly that shows status, which the wealthy would be symbolized by their clothing, rings, and all kinds of things that would represent a higher status of an individual. More attention is going to be paid to that individual because of the power that they have. So if individuals of that status are offended, or perhaps not treated and with the dignity that they think they ought to deserve, not only could you be at risk, but the church could be at risk. So, you have to think that there are conversions that are happening and people coming to assemblies and things like that, just like we have here in modern day. So there's that challenge financially. What do we do in certain situations? So James addresses that. The other thing is James chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. This is the chapter in which he's talking about, showing favoritism, and there would be a reason. We kind of water it down a little bit. There's a sense in which favoritism is still shown to the beautiful and the rich. I suppose that's a human flaw, but it's hard not for that to be prevalent in society, even among churches. When you have someone who is rich, who's making a sizable contribution to the church, it's amazing the little power that individual has because of the size of their contribution. You say, well, that never happens. Oh, yeah, it does. And it's unfortunate. Shouldn't at all. But sometimes individuals like that think that they wield power in the church. And they're not elders or anything, but because they have, material power, they wield it. And sometimes there are leaders and elders who yield to those individuals. You certainly don't want to make that individual, you don't want to offend them and run it off. So, um, and it's just, it's just sad, isn't it? That's just kind of something that's sad that happens. That's never really talked about, but we all know it exists. At least, um, I think the majority would. And if you realize um, how wealth impacts our thinking and our preferences, um, it's a very it's a line that can be crossed without realizing it on our part. So James is going to be dealing with that kind of thing. So we have here nestled in the favoritism to the rich. He says, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. It is not the rich who what? This is a theme in James. It's not the rich who oppress you and personally drag. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into the court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called? This is in the context of showing favoritism. So it makes me think that the one who's come into the assembly, you see, and the favoritism being shown, maybe it is a child of God, maybe it's a visitor, but it's not the focus on the soul. It's the focus on the what? The benefit gained materially or physically, legally, by having someone of such status. So let's say a child of God's in trouble, and you have one of these rich, notable individuals a part of your assembly, and you've been showing him favoritism. How are you going to get out of the trouble? Can you go to so-and-so and say, hey, can you speak a good word for me? And, oh, yeah, I can. Well, he couldn't make a phone call, but maybe he could get out his megaphone and, get his chariot and go over somewhere. But it's the idea that he has influence. And we want to have people of influence. It's good to have people of influence if they're good people and not just people who are of status but are not people who are members of the Lord's church or people who want to do right or live righteous. It's not the status that we want to obtain. There's going to be challenges of simply being Christians and living what's right. And I'm not saying we shouldn't honor people and all this, but James is indicating a different thing that's happening in the church, that you're almost becoming dependent upon the wealthy instead of dependent upon whom? God. It's always a challenge. Always. So it's the oppressors are those of status. And yet they're the ones that drag individuals to court. And I suppose we're to infer from this that he's reminding them that it's the powerful who bring the legal cases against you. And so how are we to, if we are the oppressed, how are we to treat the oppressor? So it's, you find this in the book of Proverbs too, in regard to wealth and all of those things. Now, not only legal challenges, but they had social challenges as well. Look at James chapter 5, verses 5 through 6. We looked at a little bit of this early. But you have lived luxuriously on the earth and had led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. Uh, all I'm illustrating here is the social challenges. Most, I'm sure, of the Christians are not wealthy. In fact, the emphasis is placed in James that the gospel, that God chose the poor. Okay, well, why would that be said? He chose the poor so they could be rich in faith. Why is that? Yeah, it's like the challenge Jesus said. It's hard for a rich person to enter into heaven. It's not impossible. It's just that that individual has the challenge of where his trust is placed. If you have a rich person who has his faith and trust in God, that's a whole different animal. That's different altogether. Yes, Charlie? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and and it happens that way too. Is you have some successful businessman who becomes an elder, and he thinks the church is a business, and he treats it like a business, and he wonders why everybody's running away from him.
When I was a young man, I was trying out for a youth minister position at a congregation that had a big eldership. And when I met with the elders, one of the elders was sitting right by the filing cabinet on that side of the elders' room. Several years later, I came back to meet with him about something else. That same elder sitting at the same place, at the same spot, right by the filing cabinet, because everybody knew exactly who controlled it.
Well, I'm just glad that our elders are both rich and they're also humble. Uh-huh. And this is where? This is where? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's, when we have the attitudes, it's, we say my church is, but, it's the Lord's church. When I first started preaching, I was introduced to this, and I was preaching for a smaller congregation, and a family was were the ones that were in charge over everything. They made it known. So um, it was an interesting thing, and I think a lot of James would apply to that. So they're having challenges in the legal realm, the social realm. Um, they're having challenges in facing, um, the relationship with the material, those in charge, and so you can imagine it's the first century is not like ours is. There are certain um, they didn't enjoy the freedoms that we have. Um, to a certain extent, the Romans allowed certain freedoms, but it was the Romans. um, so if you have Christians who have come out of paganism, and you have Jews who have come out of Judaism, and they're in one church, not only is there challenges between these two groups of people, but everything else in the culture. Mm. Brother Terry was talking about India, how the Hindus control everything. It's very difficult if you're not a Hindu. Um, if you convert to Christianity or anything else, that you lose opportunity. I would think that's true in a lot of areas where there is you know, uh, a national, religion, in Arab countries and things of that nature. You're going to be really oppressed if you're a Christian. So that's the situation I think that's undergirding James. And so when he writes, he's got a broad swath that he's reaching out to. Okay, because we're talking to the Christians who are dispersed. And so he's addressing broad ideas that are heavy principles, thoughts. The specific application, I think, is up to those in the situations. How do you apply this in the situation in which you find yourself? So, in regard to James, what I talked about his name, James, the half-brother of Jesus. The interesting thing is, not all Jesus, you think that if you grew up with Jesus, that they would be believers in him at a very early age. But evidently, there's some, according to John 7, verse 5, his brothers were not yet believing in him. I think it's sort of the situation where there might be jealousy early on. How can you? It's almost like you go to the Joseph story and the brothers. Joseph is obviously being designated as the prince over the sons, over his brothers, and he's the youngest because he's wearing the robe and all. He's going to check on them. Who goes out and checks on them except the one who's been designated by the authority, and he's going to give a report back to his daddy. This is somewhat, disconcerting to the brothers because they see Joseph being elevated. And I think he's elevated in the sense that he's the youngest, but also think, as my famous teacher always indicated, Dr. Rodney Cloud, he's been designated as the prince over the sons. He's the one that has been given somewhat oversight and status. He's the one that's wearing the robe. He's the sheik, if you want to put it that way. He's the young one that's moving up. And the brothers despise him. So you see what jealousy does. What about David and his brother? Eliab, and all, see the jealousy? So, you may have some of this kind of stuff, certainly not with the family of Jesus, but it's interesting that you do find some of this stuff, at least hints of it that's mentioned, that his brothers were not believers in him yet. Now they become, of course, and in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 7, let's look over there at the resurrection appearances. We have, then he appeared to whom? James. Yeah, Jacob. It's James. We'll go with James, okay? But see, you know something that people don't know. So that makes you better. Okay. Yeah, gnosis. So he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared to me. But don't you find it interesting that James is mentioned? He appeared to James. So when you piece it together, it looks like James kind of had a road of transition of seeing him as his brother and what, and then things have changed, and James becomes a dominant leader in the early church in Jerusalem. In fact, he's not, he's the half-brother of Jesus, and he carries a lot of influence. And when Paul and others come down to talk about the Gentile challenges and the inclusion of the Gentiles, they go to James and the elders. So James is one of those individuals that you would describe as one of the leading men. Not all leaders are elders. Some are leaders that aren't elders. They have a lot of influence and wisdom about them that have made them individuals who are, go-to people. That's okay. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. James is involved. James is known. See, they probably don't know the names of the elders, but everybody knows who James is. So you can see there's a lot of status with who James is. Now, I find it very interesting, if you'll go to the book of James. Notice how he describes himself. This is what we want the rich, people of status, people of influence. This is the kind of attitude they need to have. Then God can use them for good. What does James say about himself? I'm a bondservant. That's the lowliest of low. I'm a human being, non-status. Of who? Yeah. Of God and my brother who is Jesus. That's right. No, you say that. Of my Lord Jesus Christ. So now you get his attitude. So that's James. He's not lauding his family background and lineage. That's why I love John the Baptizer. Who are you? Oh, I'm just a voice. Why are you doing this? What when he was under interrogation? Well, he could have said a lot of things. Yeah, Gabriel appeared to his parents, right? Remember that? He was a promised birth. He could have said all kinds of things. I had a father who's, a person of status. He could have gone on and talked about his lineage. He never does. I'm just a voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. That's the kind of person, whatever poor or rich, that's the kind of person God can use. It doesn't matter on your, wealth or accumulation or where you live. So that's James. Even though he is prominent, there are, it's interesting. I've got a book it's a whole movement in scholarship of the fight between two churches. You got James Church, and you got Paul. And there's this whole academic field of study that talks about the divide between them and the hatred and all this and who's going to become prominent. It's a bunch of hogwash. You talk about, taking stuff out of context and wishful thinking. Why do they all do that? It's to discount the biblical text. That's why. And it's just odd. I was reading this book for a report, and this guy's talking about the conflict, the early church, between the church of James and the church of Paul and even Peter, the divide that's happening. And now we've come out, and it's just interesting.
I see among the students that I teach, when I bring this question up, they see through it quick.
Yeah.
They don't have advanced degrees, but they just see from the text there's nothing to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the whole book of Acts is illustrating that, but then it gets resolved. But what they do is they go from that as a springboard to perpetuate, the rise of 2 or 3 movements. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I know it. Mhm. Yeah, and even Peter got caught up in the pressure we read about in the book of Galatians. So we've got the challenge of all that happening. James, being a respected leader, he's mentioned quite a bit in Acts 12 and 15, particularly where we have the conference, the get together um, of the leaders in the church, talk about the Gentile issue, because there are some who are forcing circumcisions, a component of Judaism, upon Christians, upon Gentiles. Developing, I guess you had to become a Jew first, then you became a Christian. And that had to be dealt with because it was causing an upheaval. So, James has emerged as a unifier, actually, and one who is an important leader who is known. I suppose his influence is quite wide because it's to the diaspora, the dispersion of the Christians. So, his brother is his Lord. It's his Lord. He's come to recognize who Jesus is. Okay, I've got an outline here. You can look as you read it to see kind of things. I wanted to show the outline because you can see it's kind of like this. It goes to one theme, then it might go to something else, and it's like, okay, can you just stay in one area and talk about this before you leave it? But see, he'll talk about this, go to something else, and refer back to something else. That's exactly what Proverbs does. You ever read Proverbs? You have things on the tongue, and you go over here, and it goes back to the tongue. Wealth, rich, poor, all the stuff.
Does that look familiar, that kind of approach to you? Because you were bad about doing that.
Oh, I am? Okay. Well, thanks, David.
I have years of experience doing
Man. Okay. It's not a criticism. I love to be eaten by minnows, right? Okay. Okay, the character of the Epistle of James. Perhaps the letter is the wisdom literature of the New Testament. It contains erratic content. If you read it, you'll recognize it's kind of, erratic. It emphasizes wisdom. It contrasts good and bad behavior, offers a blessing. Now, the purpose. This makes it, the purpose of James, kind of difficult. But I think James 5 and verse 20, or 19 through 20, is probably the best stab at the purpose of it. My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth, and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. So think about those who've been dispersed, the challenges that they face. Maybe some have left, or some have thrown in the towel, or some by pressure have somewhat become ashamed of the gospel, as Paul would say. And so James, in writing to the churches, is calling for a reclamation of these people to remain true. And so maybe the best part of this book is a reclamation project of Christians who've gotten caught up in the worldliness of their environment. Okay, That's it. Any final comments before we depart? It was orderly, wasn't it? My presentation was orderly. Yeah, okay. Well, I think y'all's questions was somewhat erratic. You know, they were all over the place.